In this short video, I'm going to explain how to efficiently use JSTOR, both as an instructor and in terms of how you can guide your students to use the resources that we have here most productively. So the first thing I'd like to point out before I walk through the search and the best way to use it in a skillful way is notice up top that it says access provided by Bishop Kinney High School. If you or your students don't see that line, you're not actually going to be able to view full-length content inside of JSTOR. So it's important that you've set up your account properly. Remember, the first time you log in, you have to use the credentials that were sent out by Tim Yoakum, and then you can make your own account so that every time you don't have to use that common Bishop Kinney login with that difficult password. So you can see that in the top right corner here, it does say Paul DeGiorgio, and I can go into my account there and look at my saved resources and so on. Okay, so encourage your students to make their own account, because depending on how often you'll be using JSTOR, which is hopefully relatively frequently, they'll really get a lot out of having those shortcuts, and they can bookmark articles and so on and so forth. It'll really behoove them going into their undergraduate work to be familiar with JSTOR before they even set foot on a college campus. So what I'm going to show you here is really how to narrow down your searches and help your students not be overwhelmed by the bevy of content that they're going to find here on JSTOR from various academic disciplines. So let's just say that we're going to search for the Gettysburg Address. And I'm intentionally, as an English instructor, picking something that's most famous as a historical document, and in a moment you'll see why. So you can see here that I'm pulling nearly 14,500 search results, which is obviously too much to get through in any reasonable amount of time. So what we want to do is take a look at how we can narrow down the types of content that we're getting, both in terms of the medium, so whether it's a journal or a chapter in a monograph. We also want to take a look at how to filter by discipline, how to narrow down the publication date. As you're probably aware, a lot of college-level scholarship pre-1960 or so is going to be written in a much more difficult way. You'll have references that are far less familiar to the students. So generally, I would recommend that you go with relatively recent stuff. You might even want to go from 2000 to 2020. And if you're working in a scientific discipline, as you know, it's very important that you're working with the most up-to-date information in your field. So the very first thing I'm going to show you here, we have a couple of buttons here. We can click journals, or we can click book chapters. Notice that we have far more journal articles. So a little comment on the difference here. Typically a book chapter is going to be presented in such a way that you would really have a fuller understanding of the content if you read the full monograph, the full book. So I tend to tell my students at the prep level and the honors level, book chapters are okay if you have no alternative, but typically I think that a journal article is better just because it's a standalone work of scholarship. So you can see that the problem with this, of course, is 11,714. So we're still working with quite a few items here, too many to really get through in any short amount of time. So the next thing that we want to do is we'll go ahead and narrow down the date. Let's say that we're going to go 1980 to 2021. Make sure you click apply. You'll see that brings us down to 7,000. Next, let's just take a look here at the general feed, and I'll point out a couple of things before I show you how to narrow it down by discipline, which you can already see is on the left here underneath subject, and we'll expand it out in a moment. So as students, or you, are going through here, taking a look at the offerings that you have, there's a couple of significant things just to be aware of as you quickly scan visually. First, notice that you can download the full PDF. You can also save it, which is essentially bookmarking it. As I said a moment ago, that's one of the benefits of making your own individual account. These saved papers that you bookmark are going to be linked to your account. So if you go in there, you'll be able to see everything, and you can organize it into workspaces, which is the JSTOR term for folders. Okay. Lastly, you have this button, Cite This Item, which the students love. As you know, Bishop Kinney uses MLA, I think, across the board in all departments. So the students simply have to copy what's here and put it directly into the works cited page. Make sure that your students are aware that nothing should be in a works cited page that isn't actually cited in the paper. Otherwise, what they're giving you is a bibliography, which at the high school secondary level just is not appropriate. A bibliography might be appropriate for a undergraduate thesis or a dissertation or something like that. But I tend to tell students only go with the works cited. I don't need a full bibliography of everything you looked at, but didn't actually cite in the paper. Okay, and again, make sure you talk to your students about plagiarism, of course, because they certainly shouldn't read something and then leave it off the works cited and paraphrase it in the paper without citing it parenthetically according to the rules of MLA. Okay, so there we have that. One last note about this is occasionally you'll find that in these MLA entries, some of the content is rendered in all caps. And of course, MLA says that on a works cited page, it shouldn't be all caps. And students often, they want to just copy it and not change it, which we understand why. I mean, they know this is the basic format. Other than JSTOR that you see right here in this top entry, which you, of course, want to leave all caps, author last names should be written as they normally would. You see this one is correct. And then the title and both of the article and of the journal, those should be written, as we would normally write out these words, not all caps, in other words. So students often ask, why is it in all caps? It just depends on the publication. So when they push the data over to JSTOR and the paper is cataloged or chronicled, they're just pulling that information directly, and that's what's producing these citations. Okay, so again, you want to avoid the all caps if you see it. It's a subtle sort of thing that makes a difference in your writing. Lastly, as we're scrolling through here, first of all, tell your students they want to avoid reviews. Okay, typically, I mean, maybe if it's typically it's going to be a review of a monograph, a full-length book, that I think is just often not what we want our students to focus on. We want to find actual journal articles. So if you go up here, let's see. We can, well, I thought there was a way to eliminate reviews from what we see here, but it appears that there's no toggle button to do that. I'm, of course, filming this on my iPad, so it's possible that on the desktop version of the site, there is something that I'm thinking of. At the very least, just tell your students that they want to avoid reviews for the most part, okay? So as they're scrolling through here, something else that they can take note of is the length of the article, right? So this first one we see is 19 pages. The second one is only 1 page. It's a very short review. 14 pages for the third one. My point is, if you have your students using JSTOR to write a research paper or something else that requires secondary sources, typically it would benefit them to be looking for shorter works. Now again, you don't probably want something that's a page or two. You want something that's an actual full-length paper that's driven by a hypothesis and so on. But you'll find on JSTOR occasionally papers that are 30 or 40 pages long, which I would imagine, depending on the course you're teaching, is simply too much to ask the students to read, in addition to whatever the primary source is. Okay, so there we have that. Now, as we're going through here, we see that we're going to have all sorts of different disciplines. So I already said that I was going to show you on the left here how to narrow down what we get. One thing that's nice is you can see in parentheses how many individual entries you have for these various disciplines. Okay, some of them you see it's quite a few. American Studies, 1,960. Others, only a couple. Okay, so as a English instructor, I'm going to scroll down and click Language and Literature, and you can see that brings us down to 1,306. Okay, so essentially that is my last trick for using JSTOR as efficiently as possible. As you can see, it's still quite a lot, but all I typed in was Gettysburg Address. So if I was looking for something more specific, let's say the rhetoric in the Gettysburg Address, I could simply plug that in right there. And right out of the gate, you see that I'm starting with 2,918. And notice that on the left here, all of my results that I've narrowed down or refined have been reset. Okay, so I could go from 2,918 to 2,142 by clicking my journal toggle. I could again narrow down the years within which we are searching, just as we did moments ago. Make sure you click apply. Brings us to 899, and then the last thing that I would do is again go down to whichever discipline I am working within, language and literature, and you see that brings me to 250. Obviously still quite a lot, okay, but compared to the original 14,000 results that we had a moment ago, it's really quite reasonable. And we could, of course, further narrow it down here. I mean, this is okay for our purposes for this video to just add rhetoric here. But, you know, depending on what you have your students reading, for example, Power in Melville's Moby Dick, you can really go with however specific of a search that suits your purposes, depending on what your student's writing. Of course, misspelled Melville there. I do have one final remark, and if you have your students pulling secondary sources from JSTOR and you want them to have an individual, unique hypothesis that isn't just something recycled that they read, even if it's poor, right, or not cutting edge and brilliant, which is to be expected, right, in a secondary prep school, I would encourage your students to try to come up with a hypothesis before you send them to JSTOR, because what will happen if you don't do that is your students will just take something that they found on JSTOR, regurgitate it, possibly commit plagiarism, and it's just not establishing the sort of creative individual thought processes that we hope our students can learn here at Bishop Kinney. All right, that's all. Contact me if you have any questions.